Dr. Ramsland, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
It's an honour to sit down with you. And, you know, obviously you're a fascinating individual. But could you please tell us about your journey into forensic psychology, but also what sparked your interest in extreme offenders?
Okay. That was not something I aspired to do. So I've had a long journey, circuitous journey into this field. I originally was teaching philosophy at Rutgers University. I had no idea I'd ever be in forensics, but something happened and I decided to switch everything in my life, and I found this master's program at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in forensic psychology. So I went for it. I was writing for the Court TV website at the time. I ended up reporting on multiple serial killers. And then I also got a job teaching at a university and creating whole programs around forensic psychology, and also a master's program in the criminal justice department. So it all came together as this became my specialty: extreme offenders, mass murderers, spree killers, and serial killers. And along the way, I had the opportunity to interview some of them in depth, not just, you know, correspondence or anything, but really long, years-long kinds of interview situations where I then would write books about it. So I've published 73 books.
Wow.
Not all of them on serial killers.
That's incredible.
But lots of different topics, but since probably 1997, so 27 years, I'm focused on forensics.
Wow. And you've worked with the police, the FBI and police, haven't you? You've worked on a lot of cases, I believe. Is that correct?
I work with former FBI profilers.
Yes.
So not the FBI, not any official capacity. I've written books with former FBI profilers, and sometimes I've consulted on cases they're working on as retired agents, not, so that's not working for the FBI. I've done police trainings, quite a few. I've done coroner trainings. I consult with coroners on death investigations. I have a whole text on that, and I taught a course on the psychology of death investigations. So there's a certain angle on death investigation that psychologists would have some expertise in, such as suicidology, for example, or staged homicides. So I've consulted on some of those.
Yeah. And what would you say would be some of the challenging aspects of, in particular, understanding serial killers?
Well, serial killer isn't a criminal type. It's a description of behavior. It's if you've killed at least two people on two separate occasions, you qualify to be called a serial killer. So that's a lot of categories, and there are a lot of motivations, a whole spectrum. We have thousands of people documented as serial killers. So it's trying to generalize about them as if they are a criminal type is difficult to do. Mass murderers, easier, because there's a lot of commonality among them in terms of their mental frame and kind of rigidity and frustration. But serial killers really have a much wider range of behavior and developmental trajectories. So it really depends on who I'm talking to. Like, for example, the book I recently published, The Serial Killer's Apprentice, that was talking to a guy who, at the age of 15, had been brought into a situation by an adult predator that, so he's a serial killer because he murdered people. So technically, he fits the definition, but he had none of the motivational spectrum of the adult predator. And in fact, he is the only accomplice to actually kill the predator to end it.
Wow.
But he did participate in murder, but he's so very different from Dean Corll, who was the adult, and he's so very different from Dennis Rader, the B.T.K. killer, that I also interviewed. So when you ask about challenges, it's going to really be about context.
Yeah, and you just mentioned that you interviewed BTK, the BTK killer, Dennis Rader, and what would you say were some of the surprising revelations that you found with regards to interviewing him?
I can't say I was surprised because I've been studying serial killers for years leading up to that encounter. I've been talking with him for 14 years. I wouldn't say there wasn't really anything surprising, but just that kind of raw experience of regular contact with him. I met him, I went to the prison, we talked on the phone several times a week. He wrote long letters. Sometimes he took assessment tests. So I had a wide variety of ways of talking to him. I also knew the DA in the case, so I had access to her records and talked to some of the victims' families, even though they really weren't going to be part of the project. But talking to Rader, really, he was easy to talk to. He's not like some other killers who are very pushy and might call you at all hours of the night, waste your money, waste your time. There are, and I wouldn't even undertake an interview like that. They're just game players. Rader was what I consider the reason I wanted to work with him. And someone else had started this up, and then I ended up taking it over. The reason I wanted to do this is because he's kind of an outlier to some of the formulas we have about these offenders. He didn't have all the, any neglect or abuse in his childhood. He grew up in an all-American home, religious, intact grandparents on both sides, farms, the whole thing. He didn't seem like a kind of person who would become a serial killer, but he aspired to do it from his teenage years. And he was unusual and different in that respect. And he wanted to work with me. So that's one of my criteria. I don't want to do this kind of project with somebody who's just going to play games and lie. And certainly he would still be considered probably manipulative, and obviously he wants to show me a certain side, but I had multiple documents, I had the police interrogation, I had all kinds of stuff about him that, sort of precluded him from completely fooling me. But still, he can lie. We're in the middle of this thing right now where people are thinking he has more cases than he confessed to, which is to say then he lied really to everybody, including me, or they're wrong, and he confessed to the 10 murders that he did. And just to give context, in case your listeners don't know, he murdered people in Wichita, Kansas between 1974 and 1991. He had some stretches of time in there where he wasn't doing really anything, which also makes him unusual. But he started with a family of 4 in 1974 and then killed lone women after that, but of different age groups, some in their 20s, some 50, on up. So unusual. He didn't have a clear pattern. Most of the time he killed them inside their homes, but there were 2 that he took out in the home and dumped outside. So he would switch things up. He once used a knife. He would bind them, but sometimes use different types of knots. So it was hard to really make a link until he made the links by communicating with the police. So I think he was unique. He studied other serial killers, even as young as 14. He was reading True Detective magazines about other serial killers. So that made him really unusual. And we spent 5 years working on this. It was a very intensive project.
Yeah, it is fascinating, Dr. Ramsland, and it's just so unusual. You hear about this, people that commit these heinous crimes, and then we look back at their childhood, whether or not they were neglected, or if they were traumatized, or some sort of abuse, and then sometimes there's no link to it. They brought up in this happy childhood, and I mean, is there more evidence to suggest that there's some sort of chemical imbalance in the brain?
Yes and no. I mean, people process things in their own way. You can have a family of 4 boys, as he did, and they had similar circumstances, but they didn't become killers that we know of. Anyway, you can take a case like Carl Panzram, who was a very angry, reactive, and highly violent individual. And he had developed a resentment and an anger at the kind of deprivation he felt he had grown up with. And yet he had siblings who didn't feel that way. They had the same conditions as him, but they didn't act out violently. Gary Gilmore, another one. You have 4 boys in that family. One of them just became a famous writer. One of them got murdered. One of them just sort of wandered away and did very little with his life, and Gary became a killer. So each of them processed things in their own way, and their developmental trajectory toward violence is their own. So, but now back to, is there a chemical imbalance? It's really, if they have what we call psychopathy, the condition of psychopathy, and there is lots of brain research these days to suggest that there is something different about the brain in terms of emotional processing, especially moral information, caring about others, remorse for what you do. It's highly manipulative kinds of people. They lie easily. They have no real sense of integrity. They don't really care to have any integrity. They're very narcissistic and demanding of, almost in an infantile way. And we are finding that there could very well be brain implications with that. But not all serial killers would qualify as psychopaths. So it's not really necessarily about that either.
Yeah. And do you think also that empathy has a role in some of this as well? Do serial killers almost all the time lack empathy?
No. And we've had serial killers who've turned themselves in, who've hanged themselves, who've asked for the death penalty. They don't entirely lack it, but those who have, this condition of psychopathy, yes, they lack empathy, and that could easily be the way their brain processes information or fails to process information. We have found that they're very reward-oriented and not really attuned to the suffering of others, or unless the suffering of others is their reward, obviously. So remorse really isn't part of the picture for them. They're narcissistic. What they want is what matters, not what's happening to somebody else.
Yeah, and with working closely to Dennis Rader, what were also some of your findings that you found out that you were quite surprised?
I wasn't surprised by Rader.
Nothing. No.
Not really. He had this theory he called Factor X, that he said all serial killers have a Factor X. It's a motivator. Some people have misunderstood him to mean it's demon possession, because at one point he said maybe he's a changeling and maybe it was demons, because that's something his minister had suggested to him. But Factor X is simply, what is it that motivates me? And with Rader, he was motivated by wanting to be significant. So he was seeing in these True Detective magazines a sense of the fame they were getting, cover photos, and, a lot of headlines were going on in the 1970s of serial killers like Ted Bundy. And so he noticed that. And also coupled with that, he wanted to subdue women. He wanted women to feel completely powerless in his presence because girls made him feel off balance, and he didn't like that. As the oldest of 4 boys, where he'd always felt kind of in control, girls made him feel terrible, and especially female teachers, because he was a terrible student. So he felt humiliated by his mother, by teachers, by girls, and he developed these fantasies of girl traps or tying them to railroad tracks to exert his complete power over them. So that was another part of his Factor X. And then he also developed a fetish for bondage. So with the bondage element and subduing females and wanting to be famous, that kind of all wrapped up when he would read about serial killers and wanted to be considered among the elite serial killers. He wanted to be significant.
Yes, yeah. One thing I've got to ask you too, Dr. Ramsland, is, and this is just extremely bizarre, I don't understand why, but if you look at Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, if you look at Ted Bundy, you look at the women that would flock to their court case, and most of these guys would get thousands of fan mails, and women would just find them extremely attractive. I don't understand the reason why, but what is the portrayal of women's attraction towards serial killers?
Okay, well, that's not what I study, but I'll attempt to talk about it. It's more of a sociology question, and I don't actually look at the fan base as much as I look at the, from the point of view of the offenders. But there's a variety of, and it's not just women, by the way. There are males who do this too. So there's a variety of responses, positive responses to these offenders. Part of it is some of them want the fame, they want to share in that fame. So if they're that person's girlfriend, then they get mentioned too whenever that person, and then they also feel this sense of ownership. Some of them want to exploit it for money. The young woman who got engaged to Charles Manson basically thought when he died she was going to inherit his corpse, and then she was going to parade it around the country in a carnival like way and collect money on it. And then he immediately, when he heard that, that was it for the engagement. Some of them see a little boy. What their feeling is that before this person became violent, they were a vulnerable little boy, and so they have this maternal sense of, I'm going to take care of them, or I'm going to change them. I'm going to be, they're powerful men who don't stop from any social laws or mores. So they're like alpha males, and if I'm the person involved with them and I change them, I'm powerful. Some of them are attracted to them because they come out of backgrounds of abuse, and so this is like being home. So it's again, with them, you can't generalize. There's a lot of different reasons why some of them are attracted. But now, in this most recent iteration of Ted Bundy fandom, where we have, it's almost bizarre, some of the stuff that goes on. Like one woman tattooed his bite mark on her butt. She has a video of her dragging herself across the floor as if he's just ravaged her.
It's so weird.
It's so weird, and it's also so disrespectful of actual victims. They're not thinking like that. They're just being cool on TikTok or whatever. But part of it is the media has recreated Bundy into this charming, attractive, confident alpha male, which is not actually what he was like. He was insecure. That was part of why he was killing these girls, because he was trying to get power over girls that made him feel inadequate. He wasn't a smart law student. He hardly went to classes, and when he did, he hardly understood anything that was going on. So they've recreated him by using actors, the same with Jeffrey Dahmer, by using good-looking actors that are going to hook an audience. And people get very caught up in that, the image of these guys on screen portrayed by handsome actors, and think that's who they are. And they don't really go deeper to check out what they were like. So in a way, some of the attraction recently has just been about a real superficial presentation of these killers on these mediums, that they're just trying to hook an audience, and they know the only way they're going to do that is if they have an attractive person. So that's become kind of the new way of people getting into serial killers. And there was a website called Hug a Serial Killer. It's bizarre to me too. I've sort of watched the whole thing evolve, and this latest one, I know we can lay at the feet of the media for recreating these killers. Now, if they ever really thought about it, Dennis Rader, when he was killing, was a good-looking man, and they haven't really exploited that, because when he was arrested at the age of 59, he was a paunchy, balding, guy who wasn't that attractive. But back when he was killing, he was, and there are lots of pictures to that, but the media hasn't yet caught up to that.
Yeah, it's interesting too, Dr. Ramsland. The latest news about, I think the individual's name is Wade Wilson. So he's heavily tattooed on his face, very attractive. He's tall. He's just been convicted, I think, of murdering 2 women. And the comments that I'm seeing all over social media, women just completely in awe and just fascinated with him. Very attractive, very handsome guy. And it's just so unusual. Some of these women feel like they can change him, and, some people think he's innocent. It's just highly bizarre. It's so strange.
And there's another aspect to it that I think is a little bit deeper, and that is that females who feel vulnerable to such people are kind of dealing with their anxiety in a way by thinking they can get close to a person like this and not be harmed. If they have a relationship, then that person is not going to harm them, and in fact might even protect them. So it's almost like they're dealing with their own issues by projecting them into this fantasy relationship. I mean, some of these prison groupies are not always about serial killers. Some of these prison groupies are, it's a way to get somebody thinking about them, focused on them, but they're not accountable. The women can go live their life and not do laundry or cook or anything else. The guy's sitting there, what else has he got but thinking about them? And there are prison groupies who love that kind of association. I mean, it's a win-win in a way for everybody. I just find it so strange. It's just unusual. So would you say also, because I believe you have a background in philosophy, is that correct? I do. I taught philosophy for 15 years. Yep.
That's fascinating. So would you say that your background in philosophy might have influenced your understanding in the behaviour of forensic psychology? Would you agree?
Yeah, my dissertation and my first book were about more of a philosophy of psychology. So kind of a perspective on clinical work, not just learning the theory, but learning, about the metadata of theoretical analysis. So that my first approach to psychology was through philosophy. And in a way, I was creating my own discipline because there weren't other people doing very much with that. Some of the Europeans were, which is what influenced me. And my first master's degree in clinical psychology was based on phenomenology, which is a very European philosophy. So I think having that background, once I did end up going into forensics, was very helpful because it gave me a perspective on these ideas about what these offenders do, how to approach studying the structure of their behavior. I didn't necessarily aspire to do the very in-depth kind of what we call long-form analysis of someone like Rader, but once I was in it, it was so natural because I'd done similar things in my philosophy background. So I think because I approached both philosophy and psychology differently than most people do, it's more of a European sense, it gave me tools for doing something unique in this field.
Yes, yeah. And what would you say would be some of the most common misconceptions that people have with serial killers?
The first one, and the one I have a blog on Psychology Today, and I say the number one question about serial killers is really the first and most often misconceived notion is that they are a criminal type, because they're not. And that people tend to think there's this collection of serial killers, maybe 25 or 30, when in fact we have thousands documented, but you don't hear about them on the media, so people don't know that. They see the ones the media plays over and over and over and over. They have a misconception about female serial killers. We have plenty of female serial killers, about 15% are females, and some of them even work in teams. So people don't know that because the research is out there, and females don't tend to be mediagenic, and that's important. There's a misconception that serial killers always operate alone. About 20% operate in teams, and sometimes they'll change those teams. Like William Bonin in 1970s in LA had 4 or 5 partners sometimes, and also worked alone. Dean Corll had 2. But sometimes worked with only David Brooks, and sometimes only Wayne Henley, and sometimes with both, and sometimes on his own. So these kinds of notions that serial killers always operate in the same way, or always use the same weapon, or the same MO, or these are the things that media have fed us through fiction and film, and some of the documentaries, and it's a mistake because they can experiment, they can change their weapon, they can change their victim, the type of person they might target, and we need to be aware of that. One of the reasons I wanted to work with Rader is to show we think we have this down pat with these formulas, and then this guy comes along, and there are others like that as well. So I always, when I do this research, I want to show things that we don't know that we should be paying attention to, and trying to add a contribution to the work to help our notions about these people expand. Because if you think you have the formula down, you are vulnerable.
Yeah.
You think you know, and along comes somebody who completely defies what you believe based on a formula, and now you're at risk.
Yes, yeah. I'm fascinated with regards to you're also studying spree killing or mass murderers, and I'm in no place to lecture the public about gun control in America, because Australia is vastly different to America in gun control. But what is some of the things that you believe has contributed to this epidemic of mass shootings? In particular, we're starting to see people, as young as, 17, 18 shooting up a school. But what is the difference that you found with regards to mass shooters and serial killers?
So we have kind of 3 categories, even though the FBI threw out spree killers. Mass murderers are defined as killing 4 or more people in a single incident and single location, or loosely related locations. Like if they walk around a block, they're still basically a mass murderer. They walk through a building. A spree killer is like a mass murderer, but extended across geographic areas and time. So a spree killer might be someone who went to the workplace, killed someone there, and then went to target somebody he was angry at who lives over here. And so the person I wrote with, who's a former FBI profiler, we wrote a book called Spree Killers, and we have the largest database of anybody. I think we had 43 countries and, all different kinds of categories. We did a huge analysis of spree killers. But they share with mass murderers this mental frame of anger, need for control, need to punish, act out. Usually, in both cases, the identity is typically known, whereas with serial killers, typically not known. And so they will get away with it longer unless they make pretty significant mistakes. But spree killers and mass murderers, this is kind of the last hurrah. Often they're not always, but often they're suicidal. They know they're going to get caught. They want to make some kind of splash. Sometimes they just want to be the worst mass murderer there ever was. That's sometimes their goal. But we often see either they have a mission, they're delusional, and still could have a mission while they're delusional, or mentally unstable. Anger plays a big part, and often they've been listening to the kinds of media that inflame them, and sometimes they're visionary. They think they're going to make a big splash, and make a difference in the world. So like there was one guy, Elliot Rodger, who wanted to punish females because he was still a virgin when he was 22. He was this entitled guy who had grown up in wealth, but then his parents got divorced, and that greatly diminished his lifestyle. Still, he got everything he wanted, and yet he didn't get the hot sorority chick, so he wanted to punish them. And so he decided he killed the guys that he shared a house with and a friend of theirs. And then he was going to go down to this target sorority, knock on the door. They answered he was going to go in and kill everybody, cut all their heads off, throw their heads out in the street. But nobody answered the door, right? So he then just got in his car, his BMW that his mother just got him, got in his car and started driving down the street, running into people, shooting people, and then killed himself. Elliot Rodger is his name.
Yeah.
So he was angry. He was entitled. He was rigid. He blamed everybody for things not going his way. He thought he would kind of lead this revolution of other men who felt this way, and that somehow they'd eliminate females from the earth or put them into camps and put them back in their place. And so he had sort of a half-assed vision, but that vision inspired others to do similar things. We had one in Canada, Alec Manassian, who took a van and just rammed it into people with the idea that he would be contributing to this rebellion that Elliot Rodger had started. So it's a bunch of angry men who want the world to be a certain way, and it's not, and so they think people have to pay.
Yeah. One thing that I've listened to a professor. His name's Professor Scott Galloway. I'm not too sure if you're familiar with him, Dr. Ramsland. He said the most dangerous person in the world is a sad, broke, and alone man. And with obviously this rise in sexlessness amongst men between the age of 18 to 30, I read an interesting stat that between 18 to 30 men reporting no sex in the last year, and this could well lead to a violent storm. Do you think also that certain men that are retreating into, video games or porn or something like that, and also just aren't really socially there, they haven't been able to connect with a woman, do you think also that might exacerbate the problem?
Well, we're certainly seeing that among some of these mass and spree killers. That's some of the things they say. And in part, this this over-reliance on technology and video games and phones and whatnot has diminished people's ability to socialize. They don't go outside and play sports and things. They stay inside and they get adept at video games, but that's not really helping your social skills. So the more you put off social arrangements and social outings and, trial and error with the opposite sex, if that's what you want to do, the more you put that off, the worse it's going to be as you get older, and then you start blaming, because you can't blame yourself. You have to start blaming the women or the way society is or whatever. But some of them would commit suicide if they will take it that far, but others will push it out at people who need to be punished for this, or they want to make a statement. They want to be significant in some way. And so this whole thing, it's a movement. I'm trying to think of the name of it, the men hating women thing. I used to this word. I can look it up if you want me to. It started, I think it really came to the fore with Elliot Rodger, but a number of people who were inspired by him. Just let me give it a look up. I'm sure I can find it very quickly.
Yeah, right.
Incel, that's it.
Incel. Yeah.
Yeah, the involuntary celibates. And it's a movement that was actually started by a female. But anyway, there's a lot of males who connected into that. It makes them, they find company with others who feel the same way. And I know that Rogers thought he was going to, start a revolution. Manassian, in Canada thought, okay, here we go. I'm gonna honor that, and I'm gonna be one of those people going into it. There was a guy in Oregon, a guy in Florida that also tried to do these things as part of the incel movement. And that's the idea: is that this is going to spread, and this is going to show women, that they can't just have the freedom they want to have, and that they have a certain place in society, and that these guys deserve to have access to the best women, and etc. So, it's hard to find the philosophy. It's out there. But it does fuel violence.
Yeah, I'm not too sure if you're aware, Dr. Ramsland, but I've had two individuals on my podcast who are dating and relationships experts, and that we are actually in a situation where we're in a bit of a dating crisis. Men and women aren't really coming together, and men especially are finding it incredibly difficult to date. It's only a very small portion of men that are completely getting access to all these women. So I read an interesting stat. I think it's about 80% of men are literally not even pursuing women whatsoever. They're not interested. And this could well lead to a violent storm. And do you think that it could be obviously social media, technology? Maybe the media might have something to do with it as well. But I do. Also,
women are getting more independent, and that makes them more selective. I mean, they're not willing to settle if they, can support themselves and empower themselves. They're going to be looking for partners who are real partners, and not someone who wants to dominate them and make their decisions for them. So that's part of it too. And then you blame society for allowing women these freedoms and these opportunities and education. And so that is part of it, absolutely part of it.
Yeah. And what are some of the different findings that you found? Because have you studied serial killers internationally? I read somewhere that I think some of these individuals have killed over 100 people. Like, what have you done a bit of research on international serial killers?
I have one book called How to Catch a Killer, which has 30 cases of killers and how they're caught. And some of them are in other countries. I had a female wrestler in Mexico. That was an interesting one. I have a Japanese guy who was going on to suicide sites and luring victims by saying that he would kill himself with them so that they wouldn't feel alone, and said he was killing them and dismembering them and storing them in his little apartment. And British serial killers, South America had one guy, I can't remember, but he was killing well over 100 kids. Gabarito, I think was his name. There was a doctor in Britain who might have killed as many as 350 patients.
Oh, wow.
So healthcare serial killers is its own. Let me back up a little, because I mentioned serial killers is not a criminal type, but within the overall, category of serial killer, you have some with commonalities, like sexually compelled serial killers. And one of the subtypes is healthcare serial killers. Many are female nurses, male nurses, and male doctors. We have, I think, only 2 female doctors that I know of, but that's an entire place where the hospital systems, the healthcare systems, elder care systems, is a place of trust that these people exploit. And there was one in Austria, a team of 4 or 5 nurses were killing patients. It was like a whole band of them working together. So I've studied a lot of other countries and other historical eras too.
Yeah, it's so sad. And what about children that become killers? What have you found with regards to that?
Well, we have a number of kids. I think the youngest serial killer that I know of was 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
He killed 3 babies. I think it was Indonesia or somewhere like that. There were actually, I heard of 2 who were 8 years old. We had a girl who was 10 going on 11 who killed 2 boys in England. That's Mary Bell. We had Craig Price in our country. He's probably the youngest. It was 13 and 15 when he killed women in his neighborhood. Jesse Pomeroy from the 19th century was a boy killing. He killed a girl and a boy. Then you get in the upper teens, 17, 18, they become, they add many more victims typically. Usually they've come out of some sort of, like Mary Bell, the 11-year-old, had been highly abused by her mother, who would force men on her, basically trafficking her own daughter, force men sexually on this kid. So often they've created a callousness as a response to the abuse or deprivation that they are experiencing, and they don't have remorse, and they do act out in part because of the role models or the circumstances that we find them in. And I think that would be true unless they are, outright psychopaths and were born that way and just found it for some reason exciting to do this. I will say another thing. A myth is that all psychopaths are violent. Not all psychopaths are violent. They're not all breaking the law at all. They're certainly not all serial killers, and not all serial killers are psychopaths, though quite a few would be. But we tend to hear this word psychopath and think automatically, violent criminal offender. That's just not true of that kind of condition. But should they be born with the condition, they have a predisposition to, if they're exposed to certain things, to act out with violence and not care about it, because they themselves either have limited pro-social kinds of experiences. They've been abused or deprived or something. So it's a complex thing, nature and nurture. There's no formula for how much of which one goes into any particular decision to be violent. But you can study it in people if you have the time and, really look in depth and that person wants to do this. These kind of criminal autobiographies were, date back to the 19th century. There was a French pathologist who would go into the prisons and get these guys to talk at length of how they became offenders. And he learned an awful lot from that method. But you have to have a lot of time on your hands to do that.
Yes, yeah. And serial killers go all the way back to the 1800s, and I'm sure you would...
way back.
Yeah, and I'm sure you would have done a little bit of research and study in Jack the Ripper. And what were some of the findings that you found about that case? Because they never caught him, did they? They never found out who he was.
Him or her or them.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So Jack the Ripper is another one with lots of myths around it. I've been to Whitechapel several times. I'm not convinced there's the canonical 5. In other words, the official 5 victims occurred in the fall of 1888 in the Whitechapel area, but they were treated so differently that I'm not convinced they're all attributable to one killer. There are at least 334 suspects because I read one book that was 333 and they didn't have one that I knew about. So that's how many, that's how confusing this case is. Some females are suspected, some males are suspected. There are whole groups that are suspected of killing off sex workers to make some kind of social statement. There's a big thick book about that. So, choose your favorite suspect. You can make a case for them, and people have. There's probably a new book on Jack the Ripper almost every year.
Yeah.
So I do like the sort of attorney / doctor idea. That was an interesting one. And actually, that was an Australian author who, Montague Druitt was the name of the suspect, and there is an Australian who has written a couple books, excellent books on the subject. But we don't have proof one way or the other, no matter what anybody says. It's speculative, and yes, you can make a case, but logic isn't the same as truth. And just because you can make a case doesn't mean you have the case made.
Yeah.
And then, there's a common cognitive error that many people make when they are trying to figure out a cold case like that. And it's called Wizziati. What you see it's called Wizziati because what you see is all there is. Okay, so you take the first letter of each of those words. What you see is all there is. And people fall into the trap of thinking we have the entire corpus of evidence in front of us, and all we have to do is string it together to make it make sense. But we don't know if we have all the evidence in front of us at all. We have no idea.
Yes. Yeah. What's your thoughts, I guess, on just where we go from here? Because, I mean, there are thousands of serial killers still at large, isn't there? There's still, I think, more cases that haven't been solved. And forensics has come a long way since, the 80s and, DNA and things like that. Where do you see it going from here?
Well, I first of all wouldn't make a statement like there are thousands of serial killers at large, because I don't know. Yeah. Nobody knows. That's speculative. True. It depends on what theory you go with. So I don't have any idea what the number is. But we definitely know that many of these cold cases are getting solved because of the genealogical DNA analysis that are linking killers from the 70s, 80s, 90s now to cases that we thought would never be solved. So we have better technology. We have better access to figuring out who might have done some of these murders. That's all good. but they also can read and study these things too and figure out ways around it, as some of them do.
Yes, yeah. And you've also studied, I believe, jury dynamics. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
And what would you say are some of the challenges that I guess also having fair trials, because there obviously has been numerous incidents where people have been wrongfully convicted of a crime, or even to the point where they've been executed. What are some of the challenges that you've foreseen?
Well, one of the ones I just mentioned, the idea that logic is the same as truth, that just because you can make a case doesn't mean you made the right case, even though it sounds good. And we are fighting against a human psychology. If it sounds good, it's true. We like to land on certainty. We don't like ambiguity. We don't like to float. We don't like holes in cases. We like a good story. And if the opposing, each of the sides has their attempt to make a story, but if we don't, as jurors, if we don't like the story, we will manufacture it in our own minds. We will remember things that are said that maybe were never said, because the human mind likes things to be complete and coherent. So jurors listen with filters. All of us do, but jurors specifically, because they're in the courtroom. They're listening with filters and expectations about the way a case should be going. And if it's not going that way, they'll tend to think of it the way they want to think of it. There's another issue with jurors, is called an anchoring bias. They make up their minds early and they can't hear subsequent information that might change their mind. And maybe they've made up their minds because they heard a lot about the case before they got here. And that's a real issue. Or they're impressed by the latest forensic science, which ends up not actually being a science, like arson evidence or bite mark evidence, which now is questioned. Until it was questioned as a science, it sounded impressive. It sounded like, wow, of course they've made their case. And many jurors are not well educated. That's why you have experts there to lead them through. And if you have experts who are biased, who did not do their work but claim they did, so they're lying, or they overstate their position, they overstate the science, or maybe it's not even science, but they say it is, then you have jurors who have to try to sort their way through this. And often it'll be about which expert did they like the best, or who told the best story.
Yeah.
So you're dealing with a lot of dynamics, and yes, lots of people have been incorrectly convicted because the way the trial went and the way juries listened. And each jury is going to be made up of people from a particular area. And the prejudices and cultural traditions and whatnot of that area are going to play a big role.
It's just heartbreaking when you hear about someone being wrongfully convicted, even to the point of being wrongfully executed. It's just so sad to hear that. But how do you think popular culture, including TV shows and documentaries, shapes public perception of serial killers and criminal behaviour?
Well, TV shows tend to oversimplify. That's the first thing, because they want to get a case done, in an hour's time or across a brief series. So they oversimplify. Maybe they'll cut out the teamwork involved and make it into a lone hero investigator. So that's a problem. Often they will represent the crime lab as being brainstorming with the investigators. That should never be happening, ever. And when TV portrays it thus, that affects how jurors and viewers think about it. But the crime lab should be entirely separate from the investigation. There should be no bias coming into that. So that's been a problem. How they portray offenders gives us the impression that we can spot them. They have some physical characteristic that sets them apart that we'll be able to recognize, so we'll feel safe, because if we see that, we won't get near that person. Usually, pretty quickly who's going to be the bad guy. We don't tend to look at the nuances of criminal behavior and the kinds of duplicity and compartmentalization that actually go on with these people, so that we then end up being surprised that, somebody was a criminal, because TV gives us these expectations, and it doesn't prepare us for real life by any means, but it makes us think we are prepared.
Yes. Yeah. So what do you believe are some of the ways that we can prevent, these things from happening? Like, what are some strategies that you think could be implemented?
Prevent what?
Well, just serial killers, mass murderers. I mean, what is...
It's just too big of a question. I mean,
yeah.
First of all, that isn't my area of expertise. I am not in the criminology arena for prevention, and I don't, and to try to put all serial killers and mass murderers in one basket, I can't give you that. I can't do that.
Yeah.
You have to have a criminologist who does prevention on your show.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's interesting. So looking ahead, have you got any projects that you're working on at all?
Sure. I have a novel series that features a female forensic psychologist who has a PI team. And she's a suicidologist, which many people have never heard of. And she works with forensic individuals, like a forensic meteorologist, which people often have never heard of. So I try to use the fiction to teach. I usually base it on actual cases that I've been involved in. And she's basically me, except I don't have a PI team. So the third one of that comes out in August. I just finished the Serial Killer's Apprentice. That just came out. And I'm doing a lot of work on raising people's awareness of the vulnerability of teens to adult predators who are looking for partners, not looking for prey, looking for partners who will help to facilitate their criminal behavior. We have never really studied this. And so that book really dissects the types of relationships these adult predators form with teenagers and bringing them into the criminal world in ways they might never have done on their own. So that's something I've been working a lot on. Yeah,
yes. And Dr. Ramsland, obviously you're passionate about this field of expertise, but do you ever feel overwhelmed? Because obviously you've studied this for a long time, but it can be quite confronting with some of the cases you worked on?
I don't feel overwhelmed. I mean, I'm not in danger doing this. Sometimes I'm horrified by what someone has done. But I have a support system. I have people I can talk to. The writing helps me to express it, but I'm in this to use what I hear and translate it into policies and into treatments and things that we can do as early intervention, perhaps. So that's I think, because I have some sense of purpose and I do have more of a clinical approach. Like, I'm not a fan of serial killers by any means, so it does I find it kind of surprising how people idolize them. I find them not to be in any way attractive people. But I'm approaching it in a clinical way, and I'm hoping to use that toward bettering things. So I think that keeps it from being overwhelming.
Yes, yeah. Dr. Ramsland, it's been an absolute honour sitting down and chatting with you, and thank you so much for your time. But where can people find you? You're on social media, I think. You're on Instagram and Facebook.
Yeah, Instagram. I have 3 Facebook pages. So.
3 Facebook pages.
And I'm pretty active on Facebook because I just like that medium for all that you can do with it. I think Instagram's a little too. I don't like using my phone for that stuff. I can't read that anymore. So I'll post on Insta, but it's really more Facebook based for me. Yeah.
And have you actually come down to Australia before? Have you been down here this way?
No, I never have. No. I don't want to be on the plane that long anymore.
Yeah.
I never have.
No, that's fair enough. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ramsland. It's fascinating discussion.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Bye.